Shalom. Shalom, welcome back to this course on our Able Code YouTube channel about the Mishnah. This is Abel Flores, and I'm grateful that you've shared your time with us to delve deeper into these metaphysical studies that make the Bible so much more than a book you have open somewhere in your house. Now that you've studied several of our Mishnah classes, I hope that when someone asks you, why do you study the Mishnah? You can answer that the Mishnah is the ancient teaching that comes from biblical times and from the prophets of the Bible itself. The teachings of the Mishnah give context to the complicated biblical code, because no text can be understood without its context. The Mishnah is the oral interpretation passed down from teacher to disciple, and that helps us interpret the complicated ancient text. A simple reading of the Bible bores us because we don't understand its spirit. I also invite you to help spread the word about this YouTube channel by sharing this video with anyone who wants to study the scriptures, the Bible, and anyone who wants to delve deeper into Judaism, Kabbalah, and Christianity. This is not a dogmatic or religious course. Rather, we're looking for anyone who wants to learn academically and with a critical perspective on spirituality. No matter your religion or your prior knowledge, if you're curious and want to expand your knowledge, this free course is for you. Now let's get down to business. We continue to explore the Mishnah teachings of this oral tradition, which was obligatorily written down in the 2nd century. Mishnah Berakhot 2:5 states, a groom is exempt from reciting the Shema on the first night, until the end of Shabbat, if he has not consummated the marriage, for he is preoccupied with consummation. There was a case in which Rabban Gamliel married a woman and recited the Shema on the first night. His disciples asked him, "Didn't our teacher teach us that the groom is exempt from reciting the Shema?" He replied, "I will not listen to you so that I may stop reciting the Shema and exclude myself from accepting the yoke of the kingdom of heaven, not even for a moment." Chapter 2 of Berakhot revolves around the Kiryat Shema and its theological axis, accepting the yoke of the kingdom of heaven, or Malchut Shemaim. Within this framework, 2:5 introduces a striking exception. The groom, Cha'atnan, is exempt from reciting the Shema on the first night and, according to the practice at the time, until the end of Shabbat, if he has not consummated the Shema, due to the concern that this mitzvah entails. The same Mishnah relates that Rabban Gamliel recited it anyway, emphasizing that he did not want to deprive himself of this acceptance for even a moment. But before getting into the reading of the night Shema on your wedding day, we must remember and explain Rabban Gamliel. Remember that he was the same one who appears in the first Mishnah speaking about the reading of the night Shema being allowed at dawn, when the sages of his generation said it could be done until midnight. Even Rabban Gamliel said that his fellow scholars held the same opinion. So what are we talking about here? Rabban Gamliel was ahead of his generation. For that reason and more, he was the president of the Sanhedrin in his time, except for a time when he was penalized by the excommunication of Rabbi Eliezer, a difficult decision he had to make. In those days, the president of the Sanhedrin was the young, 18-year-old, but as wise as a 70-year-old, Eliezer ben Azariah. You need to note this every time you study the Mishnah. Every time Rabban Gamliel's name appears, the background in question is jurisprudence, the dispute between the boundaries of the Torah imposed by the rabbis and the limits that Moses' own Torah sets for keeping the commandments. Rabban Gamliel is a special, different being. He has a profound understanding of the limits of the Torah of Moses and the authority that the rabbis held after the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. With this in mind, if you, for example, want to know or understand the complicated Apostle Paul, or, as he was originally called, Saul of Tarsus, you must remember that Paul's teacher was Rabban Gamliel. For this and many other reasons, the Pauline epistles are complicated to understand. Here, in their historical context, it is clear that Saul of Tarsus was a different character than his generation, because now you know who he was educated by. By Rabban Gamliel, a rabbi who sought to fulfill the Torah above and beyond what it fundamentally demands, and who understood the difference between a commandment of the Torah of Moses and a rabbinic regulation that protects the biblical commandment. This is precisely what is happening here. But Rabban Gamliel's energy and spiritual strength seek to fulfill more Torah, never less. That's why, in the first Mishnah about the nighttime recitation of the Shema, he tells his son's disciples, who, by the way, are coming from a wedding, from bringing joy to the bride and groom who needed help at their wedding because they were poor. That they still have time to fulfill the Shema, according to what the Torah says, which is until dawn. Rabban Gamliel always wanted to fulfill more, not less. You must keep this in mind to understand this Mishnah. What is the historical background for weddings in the Second Temple era? Why until Matzi Shabbat, until the end of Shabbat? The until the end of Shabbat detail is not arbitrary. Weddings for virgins were usually held on Wednesdays, which makes the first night, Wednesday, and the period of tension prior to consummation, that is, until the first sexual intercourse, spans 4 nights, from Wednesday to Saturday. This social and procedural guideline is explained in the Mishnah itself in Ketubot 1.1, and it was a convenience for the husband to be able to go to the municipal courts, which held sessions only on Mondays and Thursdays. There was a lot of bureaucracy at that time, without a doubt. That's why the Mishnah speaks of generally Wednesday nights, until Saturday night, as weddings at that time. Here, too, there is a very important underlying halakhic principle. The exemption is not a favor to the groom, but rather a paradigmatic example of the principle. Ha'osike bi mitzvah patur min ha-mitzvah, which means one who is engaged in one mitzvah is exempt from another. This is such an important principle in biblical studies and Hebrew jurisprudence that we will repeat it. Ha'osike bi mitzvah patur min ha-mitzvah, which means one who is engaged in one mitzvah is exempt from another. That is, don't do 2 things at the same time, lest you do neither. The Talmud interprets this verse from Deuteronomy 6 verse 7, in walking the way as your way and not the way of a mitzvah. Hence, one involved in a mitzvah is exempt from other mitzvahs that interfere with it. The Sugya, or Talmudic chapter, articulates this in Berakhot 16a and Sukkah 25a. b. There also the emissaries of mitzvah are exempt from the commandment of the Sukkah on Sukkot, or the biblical Feast of Tabernacles. In our case, the consummation of the wedding, bayat mitzvah, generates a turda, meaning concern, of mitzvah that affects the groom's kavanah, concentration, of the nightly Shema on his wedding night. Here, too, there are 2 explanatory models. In other words, Rabban Gamliel knew the rabbinic restriction against reading the night Shema on his wedding day, and he himself taught this, but for himself, he was stricter. He sought to impose the severity of the law on his own life, but not on the lives of others. Now you better understand the greatness of Rabban Gamliel. The turda and kavanah model, from which arises the exemption that the Shema requires a pure and true intention of faith in God, and the groom is mentally absorbed by the bride on her wedding night because he has to be intimate with her. Therefore, the problem here is the quality of the kavanah. That is, according to this, it is better not to recite the Shema if you are not going to have a pure kavanah. The second model is OSCK B mitzvah, although the groom could technically say the night Shema, the active commitment to a priority mitzvah of marrying and consummating his marriage with his bride exempts him from another mitzvah. In the end, his wedding will be a day in his life, but he will have all the other days to recite the Shema. However, Rabban Gamliel's gesture involves personal piety, contrary to the general rule that even he himself taught his disciples. The Mishnah records Rabban Gamliel's strict conduct, which he recited even though he was exempt on his wedding night, and his programmatic declaration, not to suspend acceptance of the kingdom of heaven even for an instant. The Gemara contextualizes this series of episodes where Rabban Gamliel acts above the standard he himself teaches. Tradition emphasizes that this is not a universal command. The normative standard remains exemption, and adopting strict practice requires the ability to practice kavanah and the absence of ostentation, in Hebrew, yohara. You must understand that today the norm or halacha is different because times are different. 18 centuries have passed since the late Mishnah, and neither people nor the world are the same. Ramban Maimonides, in his work, Hilchot Kiryat Shema 4:7, states the exemption of the groom's chot and until Matzi Shabbat if he is not consummated with his bride, and cites the episode of Rabban Gamliel. For his part, already in the 16th century, Shulchan Aruch Arachim 70:3, for codifies the exemption from reciting the Shema on your wedding night, but clarifies that today, i.e., in the 16th century, the custom is for the chot and to recite Shema, given that, in general, everyone's kavanah is limited. Therefore, there is no additional distraction that justifies exempting him. In today's 21st century practice, the groom does recite the Shema. It's interesting to know that the Shulchan Aruch, as early as the 16th century, believed that the level of spirituality and kavanah of human beings had already declined. What will remain for us in the 21st century? Now, what does the groom's exemption cover on his wedding night? The Mishnah deals with the Shema because it's the most important commandment, like a 911 call with a direct line to God without interruptions or filters. But the exceptions don't exclude tefillah, i.e., praying the Amidah or putting on tefillin. Why? Because these are commandments that are fulfilled on a single day. So here we understand that the commandment is to consummate the wedding, that is, to have relations with your now wife. And this causes nervousness in the groom, especially in that era where the culture, customs, and values were very different from those of today. For example, if your bride wasn't actually a virgin, at that time this was a catastrophe, and this created nervousness and anguish in the groom, especially considering that the bride's entire family was having a party in the courtyard of the house, and they were in one room. There were no hotels or honeymoons like in the 21st century. If you understand this, then you understand the context of this Mishnah. It's also important to understand the difference between turda of a mitzvah and turda of a recite, that is, concern for business or other secular matters doesn't exempt the groom from reciting the Shema, only concern arising from a Torah mitzvah. This is key methodologically to avoid trivializing the exception of not reciting the Shema on your wedding day. But something very different is happening here from what a wedding is today, and that is the conception of time. The wedding feast in those times lasted 4 nights and depended on the social pattern of weddings, but the entire wedding, including the signing of the documents, lasted a week. In the time of the Mishnah, weddings were divided into 2 stages, kiddushin and nijuin. Both, together, lasted approximately a week, which is why there was always a Shabbat in between, and why the Mishnah we are studying today includes the Shabbat exit. And we repeat the mentality of the character, who had a personal piety, hitter, without collective regulations. Rabban Gamliel's example inspires greater Torah observance, but he himself does not impose it on his disciples. Because Gamliel is an expert at differentiating rabbinic regulations from the limits imposed by the Torah itself for keeping the commandments. In fact, the poskim of the Middle Ages warned against assuming chumrat or pious customs that not everyone can maintain without losing true kavanah or risking yohara, which means flaunting something that you do not have or are not. Now let's move on to a section of the class that truly commends the title of this video. Because to better understand this Mishnah about the groom being exempt from reciting the night Shema at his wedding, we are obliged to understand what a Jewish wedding was like in the times of the Mishnah, or the Second Temple in Jerusalem. So here we go with 14 things you may not have known about a Jewish wedding 2,000 years ago. 1. Legal architecture of marriage. 2 stages in the time of the Mishnah. Marriage was conceived in 2 legal phases, that is, in 2 parts. A. Kiddushin/Aruzin, betrothal or consecration, which established the legal bond between the groom and the bride, and the nijuin, nuptials, which authorized married life and sexual cohabitation. This is why weddings lasted a week, because they were divided into 2. In addition to other things you will learn later, the Mishnah codifies that a woman is acquired, i.e., consecrated in marriage, through money, documents, or relationships, and freed through a get, which is a divorce or widowhood certificate. The technical detail of money includes any object of value, not a specific ring, although the ring later became customary, and ultimately, as we know, the custom became law. 2. Calendar and day of the week. Why are Wednesday and Shabbat mentioned in this Mishnah? The Mishnah's rule stipulates that a virgin married on a Wednesday and a widow on a Thursday. The main reason: local courts held sessions only on Mondays and Thursdays. There was bureaucracy in this era, as there is in all eras. Believe it or not, if the husband claimed on the wedding night, Wednesday night, that he found no signs of virginity, he could immediately appear in court the following Thursday. The Gemara adds another social justification, allowing 3 days of preparation for the banquet, starting on Sunday, when the marriage documents were signed with the witnesses. This was the first part of the wedding, or kiddushin, and from Sunday to Tuesday. All the preparations were made. You can imagine, at that time, there were no supermarkets or wedding planners. Furthermore, in those days, letters were sent and relatives and guests were notified to arrive for the second part of the wedding in the second half of the same week. There were no airplanes or cars. People traveled on foot, on animals, or in wagons. They had to wait for their loved ones to arrive to complete the wedding in the second part. 3. Ketubah, amounts, purpose, and guarantees. The Mishnah details appraisals and apportionments of the trousseau for recording in the ketubah. It is important for you to know that Judaism at this time was already far ahead of women's civil rights. In those years, outside of Judaism, women had virtually no rights or anything. The ketubah, marriage contract, usually in Aramaic because it was the common language of ordinary people, establishes the husband's financial obligations and serves as a guarantee for the wife in the event of divorce or widowhood. The classic minimum was 200 zuz for virgins and 100 for widows or divorcees. The contract also establishes a general lien on the husband's property. Tradition attributes to the great sage Shimon ben Shetach the transformation of the ketubah into an enforceable title, discouraging thoughtless repudiation. The dowry, in Hebrew, nedunya, and the property brought by the wife are classified into two broad categories in Talmudic and Mishnaic sources. Niksei meleg, the wife's property. The husband enjoys the fruits for the duration of the marriage. And Niksei tzon barzel, iron value the husband assumes responsibility for the assessed amount. 4. The development of the rite. From betrothal to marriage first, the act of kiddushin was performed. It was formalized before witnesses through one of three methods: money, a document, or a pre-wedding relationship. With kiddushin, a full legal bond was established. For example, a get would be required to dissolve the marriage. However, the custom is that the bride and groom were not even allowed to live together in a house until nijuin, that is, until after the wedding feast. By the way, this topic is precisely the case study for understanding the conception of Jesus, or Yeshua, and the wedding of his parents, Joseph and Mary. It is not the topic of today, but you should know that the wedding in those days lasted approximately 1 week, and many things happened during that week, as we are already studying. In the Tannaitic period, kiddushin and nijuin could differ in time due to the aforementioned preparation of the banquet and invitations to relatives and friends who lived outside the city, and it took days for the invitations to arrive, and even longer for the guests to appear at the wedding. Later, over the centuries, these two stages of the wedding were merged into a single ceremony, and this is the custom today. The reason is that the world, technology, the economy, and even our culture have changed. The Torah encompasses all these aspects, which allows it to be performed at any time. This is essentially what the Mishnah studies: how to fulfill the Torah without a temple and without Kohanim priests. There was also the issue of witnesses in the first phase of the wedding, during kiddushin. The validity of the act of kiddushin requires 2 qualified witnesses. Talmudic tradition declares it an indispensable condition for at least 2 Jewish adults of good community standing. Blessings. The benediction of the bride and groom, Birkat Shatanim, appears in the Mishnah in the context of meals and gatherings. The cycle of 7 blessings, Mishnah Berakhot, is standardized in the Gemara and is recited for 7 days, with a minyan and typically new faces. These are 7 blessings because it was normal at that time for a wedding to last 7 days, from Sunday until the end of Shabbat, which is why this Mishnah calls it Matzi Shabbat. The theme of new faces is very important because it means that every wedding must have new guests, such as widows, orphans, and very poor people, who are invited to enjoy the wedding and the banquet. Doing charitable works, giving alms, and helping the needy are the most beautiful customs of a wedding in the Mishnah era. 5. Wedding feast, duration, and community role. Bet Shammai says that the bride should be married, as she is, that is, without makeup, so that the groom would not be deceived, as happened to the patriarch Isaac. But Beit Hillel says that the bride marries beautiful and pious, setting a standard of benevolent praise that fosters the bride's dignity. This is the custom that has prevailed to this day, which is why the bride must give charity to the poor on her wedding day. The celebration could last up to 7 days for virgins and 3 for widows or divorcees, with festive meals and daily blessings. The community had the duty to make the bride and groom happy. They even interrupted Torah study to accompany the bride. This was what Gamliel's disciples did in the first Mishnah of the night Shema. The wedding procession was also prioritized over a funeral procession at certain intersections in the city, because the Torah gives more priority to the living than to the dead. On a performative level, the sages discussed how to dance and praise the bride. 6. Religious exemptions and the psychology of the rite. A much-cited halakhic curiosity was explained today. The groom may be exempt from reciting the Shema on the first night, and until the end of Shabbat for the entire wedding week if he has not consummated it, that is, until he has his first sexual relationship with the bride. Some say that the groom's nerves may be for various reasons. For example, perhaps because he is also a virgin, or because he is nervous that his now wife is not a virgin, causing a real catastrophe among the families. With this concern, how can one have a true and pure kavanah for reciting the Shema? 7. Virginity claims, publicity, and local practices. The Mishnah in Ketubot opens with topics of virginity, ketubah amounts, and claims. A social fact: in Judea, yichid, seclusion, of the groom from the bride before the wedding was common. That is, in Jerusalem and throughout Judea, after signing the marriage contract with witnesses at the Kiddushin, the bride and groom would separate and not see each other until the wedding feast. But in Galilee, according to the Talmud itself, this was not the custom. If the families were desired, the bride and groom could live together if the families agreed. Remember that Galilee was an agricultural world, more rural, with more rural and simple people. In Judea, on the other hand, Jerusalem was a cosmopolitan capital with people from all over the world, and also, at that time, under the imperial rule of Rome. Life was better in Galilee at that time, without a doubt, and perhaps in Israel today as well. Another custom was that whoever tied at the father-in-law's house without witnesses could not later make a claim of virginity, as seclusion had already occurred. In parallel, Talmudic literature speaks of the kol, publicity, of the wedding of virgins as a notorious event in the city, part of its social function. 8. Marital obligations and time management. The Mishnah details the frequency of the ona, the husband's marital duty, according to the husband's occupation. For example, unemployed men, daily, laborers, twice a week, muleteers, weekly, camel drivers, monthly, sailors, semi-annually, and regulates absences due to study or work. This economic ritual realism shows how marital law adjusted time and expectations to working conditions. 9. Trousseau, appraisals, and permissible luxuries. The trousseau, which is the set of furniture, belongings, and clothing commonly used in the home, was negotiated on the day of the marriage ceremony, the first Sunday of the wedding week. The bride's contributions were appraised and recorded in the ketubah, following local customs. There are mishneh with conversion coefficients and surcharges that the groom assumed for each mineh contributed, a scheme that protects the value of the woman's assets within the marriage. At that time, it was normal to divide assets in each marriage. Those were difficult, very difficult times. This is not always the case today. 10. Age and social expectations. Mishnaic literature places the ideal age for marriage around 18, within the framework of a biography of life stages, which reflects the educational and professional horizon of men in that ancient world. In practice, there were variations according to class, region, and circumstances. Incidentally, in Galilee, people married even younger, believed not long after the bar mitzvah. 11. Where the wedding took place and what it looked like the typical location was the home, or a courtyard with a communal banquet. Sources mention the house of the bride and groom, Bet Shadanim, and the bride's entry into the chuppah, an early term associated with a wedding shelter or canopy. We do not have a uniform iconography of the chuppah in the Tannaitic period. The stable use of a textile canopy as it is today is later, but the Gemara already uses the language of entering under the chuppah as a juridical ritual moment. It is believed that the roof of the chuppah was made from the talith that the bride gave to the groom on the night of her wedding, which, as we know, was 4 nights while waiting for the guests to arrive, who literally came on foot and on camels, but who wanted to see their family and friends get married. All of this made the groom even more nervous, as he could not have sexual relations until all the guests arrived for a wedding that lasted for days. Do we now better understand what was happening at Rabban Gamliel's wedding? 12. What exactly was being blessed? In the Mishnah, the blessing of the bride and groom appears in connection with meals and the place of the bride and groom. The 7 blessing formula, creation, joy of Zion, joy of the bride and groom, etc., and its regimen, 7 days, minyan, presence of new faces are outlined in the Gemara, Ketubot 7a, and remained the standard framework for the festive cycle. 13. Curiosities. With a legal background, Wednesday through Thursday is not a whim. It is public policy to protect rights and ensure the seriousness of the commitment, immediate access to the courts, and preparation of the feast. And finally, 14. Social dynamics and helping the poor at the wedding. Talmudic scenes describe music, dances, and praises to honor the bride, with anecdotes of rabbis dancing or carrying the bride on their shoulders. These were actually the bride's father and brothers, accompanied by warnings against ostentation. The focus is not on festive virtuosity. In fact, in Mishnah times, it was frowned upon to display material possessions and luxuries at a wedding for fear that this would trigger the evil eye and inflict curses or evil decrees inherited from the bride and groom's families, and that these potential curses would be inflicted on the new family being formed. Therefore, one of the most important things at a wedding in Mishnah times, and still today, is for the bride and groom and their families to give gifts, food, and aid to the homeless, foreigners, widows, and orphans. Giving gifts, tzedakah, alms, even inviting the poor to your party so they can eat. Rejoice as if they were part of the same family. From this comes the story of Rabbi Akiva's daughter, who on her wedding night, as she was going to sleep, removed the hairpin that wrapped around her hair and, as was the custom of the time, placed it in a hole in the wall, accidentally killing a poisonous snake that was hiding there and could have killed her while she slept. When Rabbi Akiva realized this in the morning, he asked his daughter what commandment she had performed the night before, and she told him that she had given her own food to 2 hungry people who had come into the courtyard where the wedding was being held. At that moment, Rabbi Akiva thanked God for giving us the Torah, which saves us in this life and in the next, in the world to come, or Olam Haba. Because fulfilling the commandments of helping one's neighbor, such as feeding the hungry, is a commandment that breaks the evil designs placed upon a person, whether through curses inherited up to the 3rd or 4th generation, or through the evil designs we are born with due to our astrological chart, which is the cosmological evil created in Genesis. But above all that, there is nothing that can harm you if you keep the commandments with God and with your neighbor, because Iai Mezelo Israel, the holy name of Israel, there is no astrology that affects those who believe in God and keep the commandments. This concludes today's class. See you in the next video.